painting to photography, from beadwork to woodworking, KQAL FM on the campus of Winona State University presents Art Beat. Art Beat highlights the work and accomplishments of local artists from in and around Winona. Support for Art Beat is made possible by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund.
Lights, camera, action. Today on Art Beat, we cover the Frozen River Film Festival. KQAL will take you behind the scenes to hear about the production, filming, messages, and passions from the creators themselves. Today we're joined by the director of the Butterfly Effect, Deb Wallwork. Sit back, relax, and listen as we hear from the wind beneath the butterfly's wings on today's episode of Art Beat. Take one. I'm currently joined here in the studio by Deb Wallwork. How are you doing, Deb?
I'm doing great.
All right, so let's just get right into it. Why don't you give our audience a bit of a summary of the Butterfly Effect?
So the Butterfly Effect is a film about what people in rural Minnesota are doing to help save monarch butterflies one milkweed at a time.
So what made you want to cover the monarch specifically?
Well, I opened the New York Times one day, and it said that the number of monarch butterflies had dropped 90%. It had dropped 90% over maybe a 20-year period, but then it dropped that small group of monarchs had dropped 90% in 1 year. And so I thought, oh, wow, I just was flabbergasted by that, because monarch butterflies were like robins when I was growing up. There were just so many of them. You never thought about losing monarch butterflies. And so it so happens I was living in Fergus Falls, Minnesota, where the Prairie Wetlands Learning Center, which is a U.S. Fish and Wildlife facility, happens to be. And so I started to think about maybe doing a documentary about monarch butterflies.
All right, well, let's dive into that. What was the first step in trying to make this documentary?
Well, I was very intrigued by the idea of, I had worked in public television, and all the equipment had gotten smaller and more accessible and affordable. And I thought, could I actually make a documentary about monarch butterflies just with a camera? It was a prosumer camera that I have, which is a professional level camera, but kind of the top of the consumer professional level cameras. And, could I do this? I mean, monarch butterflies it's very, very challenging to do wildlife documentaries. It's very challenging to get wildlife on camera, but monarch butterflies are not as challenging to record as some other creatures that are hiding from humans. So I thought it would be intriguing to make this film using equipment on my home computer, because I was editing all kinds of things, on a home computer, and make a film that could be broadcast quality and show in film festivals. So partly I was kind of intrigued by the idea of being a one-man band on a project and following through the whole thing by myself.
All right, and you did the whole thing by yourself? Well,
as it turned out, I hired a friend of mine, Janet Bayless, who's actually known as an artist. She's an artist with an experimental background. And I wanted to get away. I wanted this film to get away from kind of this educational sense, the educational film, a little bit, academic, or, the experts, the talking head expert, sort of public TV kind of thing. And one of the ways that I used to open up this film to kind of really sort of interesting things that were bright and thoughtful was to engage this experimental kind of filmmaking.
Right. It's interesting you mentioned how you wanted to move away from the academic educational film, because going into this, I was expecting that. I was expecting more of a documentary style education film, similar to what you would see on like Animal Planet. And there's nothing wrong with that, but I was pleasantly surprised when I saw the format of the film, and it took me a while to get into like what it was trying to do. Because I remember one quote that I wrote down as I heard it, and I was scribbling in the dark, so I probably don't have it verbatim, but everyone in western Minnesota has a monarch story that appears in your film, and it follows with the format, because what you do is you run through a bunch of individuals who each have their own personal experiences with the monarch. And there's people from several different backgrounds, different religious groups, different cultural backgrounds, people who aren't even from here, people who are from here. It really provides a wide net that shows that this is one of the unifying factors among people in Western Minnesota. Is that something you were trying to capture?
That's a really good summary of kind of how I went about it, because I did. One of the things that I kind of knew is, once again, not being a wildlife photographer and not having really close-up cameras and that could do this amazing kind of stuff, I knew that I could concentrate on the people and concentrate on the stories, and that the butterflies are, they're in and out of the film. They're all over the film. I filmed most of them in my backyard, but but that was going to be the focus of the film.
You mentioned like the academic heads and stuff like that, and they're important, but they don't always reach the common man. They don't always reach people. But when you have everyday individuals who are talking about their interactions, it becomes less of a preachy film and more of a, people can relate to it more, if that makes sense. And that definitely was my takeaway from it. This is incredibly relatable. The average individual can look at this and feel a connection to it in some way.
Well, the challenge is, monarch butterflies. I mean, there are lots of people, especially in urban areas, are aware. We're aware. We're aware of climate change. We're aware of race, and we're aware of things because we're living in an environment, in an urban environment. You're sharing a lot of ideas with a lot of really interesting people. But rural Minnesota is isolated. I mean, that's kind of part of, I think, why some people love living in rural Minnesota, because there's just countryside and, and nature all around. And yet, information doesn't travel as quickly as it does in an urban environment. And yet these are the people who are really living in the environment where the monarchs need, those fields and woods and that countryside is where monarchs are mostly to be found. And so how do you kind of make rural Americans aware of what's happening, I'm just of the general opinion. I know I'm around a lot of people who think that rural Americans are uneducated or, not even worth trying to talk to because they're politically very conservative. But rural Americans do care about the environment that they're in. And so how do we break through these ideas, that are they're damaging to our environment, with people who I think on the deepest level understand how much the environment means to our quality of life. I think that's a connection that can be made. And so that's what I was interested in doing, because, monarchs can't fly from city to city. They are flying through countryside, and so they're flying through countryside where they're defined by the agriculture department, where milkweed is defined as a noxious weed. And so we've got to change the attitude of people in the countryside. And Dr. Karen Overmeyer, who's in the film, who was the director at the time of the Monarch Lab at the University of Minnesota, that's what she started to think. If we can have little islands, if we can move monarch habitat into gardens, into people's gardens, then every farm all around that farm, there may be fields that, have the kinds of pesticides and the kinds of agricultural practices that are driving milkweed out of the countryside. But if we can move that habitat into their gardens and into the areas where people in the rural countryside, can experience the butterflies, then we can have those little islands of nurturing native plants, or the nectar plants. So that's the nurturing plant. Those are the nurturing plants for butterflies.
There's a lot I want to unpack there from that statement. The first one is what you said when it says a lot of people don't feel it's worth talking to people in rural areas. And, I'll admit, especially in recent years, there's been a lot of, heated contrast between people. So it's really good to have those people who are like, let's breach the gap, because most of these people aren't what we think they are. And it's and that's reflected in the film when you see these people who actually do care. And I just think it's a wonderful message to have, and one that we need a lot more of today. So I just want to say good job for that, and thank you. On top of that, you mentioned how small changes can make a big difference, which of course reflects the film's title, The Butterfly Effect.
Yeah.
And you mentioned this problem, that monarchs are struggling to get by, they're dying off, and the solution is just a bunch of people doing something small in their backyard.
Yes.
And
yes.
It's like that old phrase, I think it's like everyone wants to save the world, but no one wants to wash the dishes. But the thing is, washing the dishes is the first step. It's doing those small things in your backyard, and everyone does it. It can actually make a massive change for monarch populations, which I'm not it's very clever for the name of the film. But it is a great message to send, the fact that each individual can do something about this. I do want to dive a little bit into the animation in the film.
Sure.
So the animation style is, it contrasts in some parts. I didn't write down the name of this woman, but she was talking about how she used to catch monarchs in her backyard and release them in her room.
Yep.
Something that I would do if I wasn't, worried about upsetting my parents.
I think she was 13 when she did that.
I was 5 and I tried once. I picked up a caterpillar and my parents were not happy about it. But the animation there was it was incredible. It was really nice to see it. But it's also animation's used sparingly. I think her story is the only one that actually has like a long part of animation.
That's the work of Emily Fritzie. I just want to throw that in there because, Emily was another filmmaker that I engaged, animation person that I engaged from the Minneapolis College of Art and Design.
Well, you beat me to the question.
Oh.
I was going to ask where that came from. It was quite beautiful animation, but that answers that question.
She's so incredibly talented. Y'all should look her up on YouTube.
All right, and can you give me the name again?
Emily Fritzie.
Let's dive a little more into the struggles you had making this film. How did you reach out to all these people across Minnesota? How did you find them to interview them? And what was the process in getting them to be part of the film?
Well, I started with some sustainable agriculture people that are, because I knew that they were already aware about butterflies. And so that's kind of where I started. And then I started to think about, I wanted to shift things. And of course, the Prairie Wetlands Learning Center people, I reached out to them first, even before the sustainable, because I also knew they have a monarch tagging program, and naturalists, of course, are the people who are most interested in this. But then I started thinking about the idea that what is it about monarchs that we love? Why is it that people do engage with monarchs? And I started thinking about beauty. And so that's when I started going to artists and sort of saying to artists, there was a exhibit at the Cadets Gallery of people who were making art that had monarch, that monarchs were the theme, I guess, of an art exhibit. And so I went and I started interviewing artists. And then I wanted to explore. So here's a problem, and this, particularly for students who are in the biological sciences or who are going into the DNR, going into these fields of natural sciences. We cannot engage people by science alone, and so. How do we use, and I think this is just becoming, I think people are waking up to the notion that we can use art and we can also use spirituality, people's spiritual experiences of nature to engage people into because it really boils down to, why do we want to save the planet? Why do we want to save other living beings? Because they bring us to light, and we feel a connection with them that we cannot explain. It's so deep. It's so deep, whether it's, just encountering a frog that's going across the path that you're, there's some tropical frogs in the science building that I was watching for a while. God, beautiful yellow, I forget what they were called, but yellow dart frogs or something. Anyway, there's something very deep about that, and it goes beyond our intellectual interest in it. And every scientist out there knows this, but doesn't really talk about it. But so in the film, I really did. I felt like I'm not going to be able to move, especially rural Minnesotans who don't necessarily come from a scientific. They're not as engaged by a scientific explanation of why it's important to keep habitat, to have habitat, and to, when you're faced with your farm, is going to, only sustain you and your family if, you basically turn every single acre into profit to be able to pay off your debts for your equipment and for, the seeds that you're buying and all that. You're not thinking about, what is the quality of my life that I am able to watch hawks and able to see, dragonflies, and my children are able to, play in a creek. You're not thinking about that, but that is part of the reason that you're living there and that you're trying to make your living off of that landscape. So anyway, so those are the kinds of things, that I wanted to reach people at that level.
All right, well, I do want to dive into a bit of the footage you have in the film. It covers quite a large area that's not just Minnesota, right? Did you take all the footage yourself?
I pretty much shot everything except for the things that Janet shot, which were Janet did all the slow motion, the time lapse footage of butterflies, of caterpillars turning into chrysalises and chrysalises turning into butterflies. So, but I shot everything else. I shot all the interviews, and Janet did some secondary shooting of those interviews so I could cut between her footage and my footage. But yeah, other than that, pretty much everything I shot myself.
All right, I guess I'll end it off with this final question. What would you want people to take away after watching your film?
I think the takeaway is really that this whole effort that we need to make to engage people with sustainability and with having a healthy environment and a healthy planet, that really is a path of joy and delight and hope, and if we stay in that place and not in a place of despair, I think we can reach people.
Where can people find your work if you have more of it? Where can they see the Butterfly Effect?
A number of my films are on a platform called Folk Streams, which is an archive of anthropological and cultural documentaries, and there's just a wealth of things on Folk Streams that I think if you're interested in Native people and other all kinds of cultures all over the world, that's a wonderful site. So I have 4 films on that, one about buffalo, one about wild rice harvesting on the White Earth Reservation, and one about Native American Vietnam veterans.
All right, well, thank you so much for joining us for this interview.
Thanks so much.
Thanks again to Deb Wallwork for joining us on this episode of Artbeat. To see more of her work, check out folkstreams.net/filmmakers/Wallwork-Deborah. For more conversations on art, Tune into Artbeat Tuesdays at 12:30 right here at 89.5 KQAL. I'm Giovanni Bermudez, and that's a wrap.
Artbeat is written and produced by KQAL FM on the campus of Winona State University. Visit us on the web at kqal.org.